Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Certainly those who are joining us virtually and those who are joining us in person. My name is Bill Alexander. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, which includes the museum where we are sitting or standing right now. Uh, I retired after 25 years in law enforcement. I worked for the Prince George's County Police Department just outside of Washington, D.C. So I'm very humbled to have been able to spend the better part of my adult life serving in some capacity um, the community in which I served and the broader country in which I think all of us are so lucky to live and call home. The organization for which I work is most notably known for the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial, which is right across the street from the museum. It's the place where today, right now, we honor, memorialize, recognize, um, pay tribute to more than 24,000 men and women whose names are inscribed on what we view as very, very sacred walls, remembering their service and sacrifice, and to some degree, I hope, helping to tell their stories, to tell their individual stories right here in this museum, but just as importantly, to tell the story of their profession. And that is what the museum exists to do, to help tell those stories. One of the most incredible and poignant stories that we tell here in the museum is right outside of the theater where I am standing, where Eagle One, the U.S. Park Police helicopter, which responded following the crash of Air Florida Flight 90, is hanging from the ceiling of this museum. It's one of the most incredible exhibits, maybe in any museum, but certainly in this exhibit, this museum, it is the absolute highlight of the museum, I think. And it helps tell the story of what Bruce has written about in terms of the worst day, not just the Flight 90, which crashed, but also almost at the exact same time, a derailment of a metro train near the Smithsonian. Just an incredible, incredible story. And I don't want to steal any of Bruce's thunder. I have no idea what he intends to say, but I will just add one anecdotal seed that I would like to plant in terms of what I came away from when I first learned about this story. And I remember seeing a number of the videos, and of course, I've sat through the exhibit, which is right outside. One of the really important takeaways that I immediately grokked onto was that at the time that this accident occurred, the chief of the U.S. Park Police, I think his name was Chief Herring, had been chief of police for the U.S. Park Police for all of like 3 weeks. And here this accident occurs, and Don and his crew are basically saying to the chief, trust us, put us in, coach. While visibility is horrible, winds are high, the blizzard, it's the worst possible conditions to potentially go fly in. Not to mention the fact that a plane just fell out of the sky. And Don and his crew are saying, we recognize the risk. We want to go respond, making a purposeful, conscious decision to put themselves in harm's way. And that to me typifies and exemplifies the thousands, if not millions, of interactions by rank and file police officers all across this country almost every single day. Oftentimes completely unnoticed, many times completely unthanked, but there, before the grace of God go I, are the men and women every single day who say, put me in, coach. And so to me, that is the takeaway I have taken away from the Air Florida crash and the example of Eagle One standing out, sitting outside right where we are right now in the theater. So I don't want to belabor the point, but I'm so incredibly happy to be able to be a part of this discussion and also to allow this museum to host what I think is a really unique and compelling event. And of course, I would love to ask Bruce to come back up and talk to the group about his book and hopefully get you to buy a copy. So I'll close there. And Bruce, I'd love to have you back.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bill, and the staff of the museum. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, people, for coming out today on a Thursday afternoon, and everybody checking in online. I really do appreciate it. Um, uh, the I'm going to take it back to January 1982. At the time, I was uh, a former firefighter EMT in Memphis, and had withdrawn from my last semester of nursing school in January. I decided that I didn't want to be a firefighter. No disrespect. I don't want to go into a burning building. You guys can do that. I wanted to be in an ambulance. And I had was a paramedic, and a lot of people were going into nursing school, so because the job market was bigger, and I was really unhappy. Didn't want to be a nurse, and so I withdrew my last semester in December of 1981, and I was at a Christmas party when somebody, my nursing instructor, mentioned this place in Baltimore, a shock trauma center, and shock trauma had just set up this undergraduate program at UMBC, and I literally dropped everything I had, I sold everything I owned, and moved to Baltimore for the shock trauma program. But in January, I was sort of in between there, wrapping up loose ends. And on the evening of January 13th, I'm watching the news in the bar where we hung out, Jefferson Square. And I watched this video on the news that was absolutely breathtaking of this rescue of the Air Florida 90 survivors. And it was absolutely spellbinding. And it it was something that stuck with me. Part of the reason I think why it had such an emotional impact is because there was an immediacy to it that I don't think that many people were accustomed to. CNN had just begun in 1980. So by 82, things were still, we were not used to this 24-hour news cycle. And as far as I know, the Air Florida 90 crash is really one of the first major uh, events that was practically covered in real time. And we saw these people in the water um, while the rescue was still going on, which was just an extraordinary experience. And so I went on, I got in the University of Maryland program. They had this program to train to make paramedic managers, was the idea that we would graduate and be EMS system managers. Went on a different path. I got sidetracked into writing and never worked in the field again. But in all my time in school and when I started out writing, I was starting out with the emergency medical services publications. Whenever people talked about a major disaster, incident command system, communications, it seemed like the Air Florida crash was always that reference point, that case study that people pointed to in terms of how things are different from where they were then. So over the years, it was always on my mind. I just thought about that day and picked up little bits and pieces because I was in Memphis. I didn't know all the details. When I got up here and talking with some firefighters and learning about the whole chaos of that day and all the other things that were going on, the subway derailment, the storm, and I just thought, this is just absolutely amazing. It would just make an incredible book, and nobody ever wrote that book. So I had a little bit of success with my first book called 18 Tiny Deaths about the mother of forensic science. And I was in a position when you do a book, then your agent and the publisher and everybody says, "Oh, what you got next?" And Air Florida was right. I really, really, really want to write this. Absolutely, I've been wanting to write it since day one. And it was a real race against time because these people who are participants they're getting older. Some have passed on, and so it really had to be done as quickly as possible. And what I was faced with was having to track down 42, 43 years after the fact, people who were involved in an incident on this day back in 1982. And I spent literally years using every tool and resource that I could think of to track down people. I located the pilot of the helicopter, Don Usher, who will be joining us, the dispatchers who were involved in Virginia and Washington, survivors. I found people who were on the 14th Street Bridge. I found people who were at the Riverside. I found people who were on the derailed subway car. And so I had this extraordinary opportunity to document this day. There have been some portrayals. Of course, there was a made-for-TV movie in 1984, which was a made-for-TV movie, not terribly accurate. There have been some docudramas, but everything focused on the rescue of the Air Force survivors, which, granted, it was a really sensational incident, but it doesn't tell the whole story. There was much more going on, and I was very interested in. We talk about the links in the chain of survival, but how that whole thing unfolded. How did it happen? And what did first responders have to deal with? How did it all work out? And so that's what I aspire to do in my book. And in looking through various official sources, there were logs of radio transmissions. The fire department had a log of the dispatch of equipment and where it went and what time. I was able to piece together literally a minute by minute of documenting where people were and what they did. And so the book is sort of told in real time, experiencing it as it happened that day. And it's been a tremendous privilege to document it. I'm just really surprised that nobody's ever written about that day, and I feel fortunate for doing it. We have some people here today joining us who were really instrumental in that day. We have Steve Souder, who was the fire department, the DC Fire Department dispatcher, who was on duty that day, and Don Usher, who was the pilot of Eagle One, that's out in the lobby, and Steve, I would call on first. Steve um, has the most wonderful radio voice I've ever heard in my life. He's just got a tremendous voice. Interesting fact about Steve is that his first day on the job was April 4th, 1968, which was the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And riots broke out all over, and fires broke out all around Washington, and it had to be just a heck of a first day. It was really a baptism by fire, I guess you could say. But Steve had the steady hand, the steady voice on the radio that day for most of the day, and helped was really in the center of all of it and able to see things. Steve, can you hear?
I can, Bruce. Thank you.
Okay. If you would please, could you describe what that day was like for you? It had started out, there already was a big fire on the 13th and that morning on the Upshur Clinic fire. But what was it like in the center of the dispatch office? The information as it is coming in, or how did things get rolling along in the dispatch office?
Well, Bruce, first of all, let me thank you personally, and I think on behalf of many, many people, for having written this book, for documenting this story. You are correct in your reference to previous efforts with documentaries and made-for-TV movies. But I've read your book, and if anybody else has read your book, it's different. It really tells it like it is. And I'm glad that you were able to memorialize it before all of us pass on. So again, my thanks personally and on behalf of everybody out there. If you don't mind, I'm going to start this little story that you asked about a little bit earlier than just when I walked in the door. It was a Monday morning, if you will, early in the day. And I was asleep at home in a community called Montgomery Village, Maryland. I was doing that next morning. And I went to bed the previous afternoon or evening about 10 o'clock. And the phone rang. And it was, as we called it, headquarters. So when the voice said, "Steve, this is headquarters. We need you to come in," the obvious question is, why? And the answer was, well, we've got this huge fire at this vacant hospital called the Upshur Street Clinic. Well, I knew the building very, very well because in my time on the street, if you will, it was my first new area. And I knew how large it was. I knew it was vacant. I knew what a potential it was. And here, with snow coming down, it caught fire. So I said, "I'll be in, certainly." And they said, "We have invoked Plan E." Well, Plan E in fire department jargon is when you begin to call people back to duty because there is so much activity taking place. You need more hands to man reserve equipment, et cetera, et cetera. So I got out of bed. I didn't shave. I didn't shower. I didn't scrub my teeth. I just put on my clothes, headed out the door, kissed my wife, and told her where I was headed. And she says, "Be safe." So in from Montgomery County, Maryland, I head with my car, snowing pretty hard, not terribly bad, but pretty hard. And I get around the Beltway and I exit at Georgia Avenue, which is the main artery that would take me to the communication center. And I knew that it would take me also very close to the Upshur Street Clinic, only about a block and a half away. So, being a firefighter at heart, I could not resist but doing a 360, as they say, around the building in my car just to see the magnitude of this fire occurring. And it was big. And you could tell they were really struggling. The building was kind of high on a knoll. So it was hard to get to, and placement of apparatus and hauling of hose and all of those kinds of things.
And the weather was bitter, bitter cold.
Oh, bitter,
These
bitter,
guys were
bitter
out
cold.
there.
Can't believe it. I mean, bitter cold. But anyhow, I knew my job was to get to work and not to look at the fire. So back on Georgia Avenue, I get, and a few blocks down, I exit to go to the communication center, which is actually on the property of Howard University and right on the edge of a large reservoir called McMillan Reservoir, and a beautifully tranquil, uh, untouched, in many cases unknown location in Washington. But anyhow, I pulled into the parking lot and briskly walked into the building. And I said, "I'm here. What can I do to help?" And they said, "Take the radio." Well, the radio, of course, had been staffed already. And I went over and I said, "You need a break?" And they said, "Do I need a break?" So he got up and went to get coffee or whatever. And I sat down and tried to put together in my mind what we were dealing with here. And eventually the crews on the scene, they got a handle on the fire, and eventually they extinguished it. And by that time, the sun is beginning to rise, although it was a very cloudy day, but it was getting bright. And things began to reach normal, and the normal time to relieve people came about. And some of us had been in earlier course because I wasn't the only one called. But those that had been on duty all night long, they were relieved, and we took over, and then it ended up being a rather normal day, if you will. The big thing I remember about the day itself, and it points to your point about how cold it was, Bruce, is that we had so many broken pipes. Now, when people live in a house and they have a pipe break, the first thing they do is to call the fire department. We're not plumbers, but we're fixers, if you will. We know what to do. And sure enough, all day long, broken pipes all over. But anyhow, I was kind of looking forward to getting relieved at 4 o'clock. The snow had continued to snow all day long. And I kept looking out the window and kind of getting an eye full of where it was at and how much it was elevated on the parking lot and how much shoveling I'd have to do to get my car out and all that kind of thing. And excuse me while I take a sip of coffee here, if you don't mind, Bruce.
Sure.
Thank you. So I was relieved at 4 o'clock, a little before 4, about 3:30, I guess. I was relieved, and I had a choice then to go home as would be normal. But because I knew about the snow, I knew about the traffic, I knew about the workload, I said to myself, I'm not going to go home. I'm going to hang back. I'm going to just hang around here a couple hours in case anything is needed. Let the traffic get ahead of me before I begin to make the trek back to Gaithersburg, Maryland. Uh, and as I was kind of just walking around the operations floor, into the building came a dear friend of mine who was in fire department jargon called the Metro Liaison Officer. And what that meant was he was the liaison between the fire department and the Metro rail system and all of the issues that there needed to be a lot of coordination about, if you will. And his name was Magdalden Fleming, just a great guy. So he walked in the door. And he said, "What's going on?" And I said, "Well, we're just hanging around here until I head home." He says, have you eaten anything yet? And I said, no, I hadn't. So he says, let's hop in the car and we'll go over to Roy Rogers Restaurant. Now, locals will know what Roy Rogers restaurants are, but they were a fast food outlet. They were owned by the Marriott Corporation at that time, so they were a high-end kind of entrees and fast food. So we hop into his Chiefs car, and we drove over to Roy Rogers Restaurant on Georgia Avenue, right across the street from the Wonder Bread Bakery. If anybody online remembers that institution on Georgia Avenue, which anytime you went by it, the aroma of fresh baked bread was emanating, even though all the windows may have been closed. So we went in and there was no line. It was very quick. And I figured I'm going to get two hamburgers, not just one. So he ordered his part and I ordered my part. We paid. Back in the car we go and drive back to the communication center. So we get there. He says, I'm going to make the trek home. I'll just eat this hamburger on the way. And I said, okay, Chief. Well, thanks a lot for your help and the drive and the food and all. And I said, I'm still going to hang back. So I got out of the car and was walking up the small 4 or 5 step stairway to get into the building. And I walked into the operations room. And by that time, it's about 4:05, as I remember vividly. And I hear the first thing being done is airplane crash, Eastern Airlines, Potomac River, 14th Street Bridge. And I'm trying to process all of this in my mind because I'm only hearing one half of a conversation. But the conversation was between what in Washington, D.C. Fire Department jargon was called the chief operator or the watch commander of the communications center, who was the on-duty boss overseeing all of the communications activities in the city for the fire department for a particular shift. And what had happened then, and this is very interesting. This is pre-cell phones, folks, right? But the conversation that I was hearing a little bit of, and then eventually on a speaker, was from a car that had equipped itself with or had been equipped with a mobile telephone. Well, what a mobile telephone is a heck of a lot different than what a mobile telephone is today. And first of all, you had to have one, the need, and two, the money to even begin to afford to have one. But if you had the need and the money, you could subscribe to it. And in the trunk of your car, they installed a box which was about as big as a small refrigerator that you might find in a college dorm. And then in the passenger compartment of your vehicle, there was a handset, a traditional handset, on which you could, with the help of an operator, make a phone call out and receive a phone call coming in. Well, what had happened is that the person that was in the car with the mobile phone was himself on the 14th Street Bridge. And he had witnessed what had happened. It had happened in front of him. So he picked up his phone and he called the operator, not the 911 center, not fire department communications, but the operator. And he tells the operator what it is that he's witnessed and what he thinks that he hears being asked for. So the operator then calls the fire department. So you can see how this is going through several people before it gets to the real need to know organization, which was DC Fire Communications. And in the course of that, he is explaining to the chief operator, the operator is, what the caller on the scene had told him. So it really painted a very vivid picture. The caller, the guy on the phone, did a great job of explaining it to the operator. The operator did a great job of explaining it to the chief operator. And it really allowed for a very educated dispatch to be assembled, to be dispatched to this call that I guess we've always kind of been fearful about, but hoped would never happen. Because in the fire service, in public safety, in the first responder world, it is in our DNA. A lot of things are in our DNA, but one of the things in our DNA is that we're always saying, well, what if? What if this happened? Or what if that happened? and how would I react, and what would I do, and in this case, what would I send, et cetera, et cetera. So here it happened. I mean, those things which we may have thought about, maybe talked about, here it is unfolding live. So I then, having heard this dialogue in this initial dispatch, so I went over to the radio operations desk console and spoke to the person that I had been relieved by about 30 minutes earlier. And I said, hey, I'm here for you. Tell me what I can do to help you. Because I could envision in my mind that this is going to be a big, complicated, many faceted, highly coordinated event. And
one
her
thing to
name
point
was
out though,
Denise. And I said, Denise, what can I do to help you? And we had a little technique that we call typing and talking. And on big major events, the way that worked is that one person would do the talking and the other person would do the typing into the computer-aided dispatch system. And that way, the dispatcher only had one thing to do rather than two things to do. So she says, hey, thanks a lot. So I pulled up a chair and began to enter in the appropriate information. And then as time went on, and only a brief period of time went on, and she was God bless her, she was a smoker, and you could smoke in the building back then. And she probably had, Denise, rest in peace, lady. She probably had 5 cigarettes going all at the same time. I mean, it was that much of a, adrenaline flow kind of event. So at some point in time, she said, Steve, here, take it over, take it over. I don't want to do this. So I said, oh, you sure? And she said, yes, I don't want to do this. So I said, fine, I got it. So we kind of swapped chairs, and now I'm on the radio and she's on the keyboard. And that really brought me into the event in a way that I had never expected to be just 30 minutes earlier when I was getting ready to get a hamburger and expecting to go home as soon as the snow cleared. So I'm going to take a break, Bruce, because I don't know where your story goes, but I want to support it in segments rather than one big dialogue.
I appreciate that. A couple questions though. One, I want to point out though that there hadn't been a commercial airliner crash in the Washington area since 1949. So there was nobody who was working and alive at the time had any previous experience with such a thing. So this was all really, we have plans and you can plan for contingencies, but this has never happened. There was no previous experience for this before. Um, how the information that was coming into you, I understand, was sketchy, incomplete, conflicting. You mentioned at first that it was reported mistakenly as an Eastern Airlines plane, and you didn't know. Did you know exactly where it had gone down, or was there some uncertainty about whether the plane was on the bridge, in the water, on land?
The reports were indeed conflicting. Some of them came from the airport itself and the airport's fire department. But none of it was so conflicting as to think it was someplace other than where I had been told, namely the 14th Street and the Potomac River. And you don't have to be very intuitive to understand what that would mean. I mean, you knew it's in the middle of a snowstorm. You got it on a bridge. And by the way, for those members of our audience here that may not know, it happened about 200 feet from the end of the 14th Street Bridge, where the 14th Street Bridge connects with Virginia. And because of the way the geography of the Washington area is laid out, the river, if you will, is owned by DC and Virginia not. So it's not one of these things where a line goes down the middle of the river. All of the river is the responsibility of the DC government and everybody that serves in that capacity. So you have this thing 200 feet from another jurisdiction. You have it at the end of a bridge. You have it about as far away as you can get from the location that the initial units would be coming from. You have it in the middle of a blizzard. You have it in the middle of traffic, bumper to bumper, for as long as the eye could see. And the eye could see only about 4 cars in front of you because the snow was so heavy. You have all of these elements at work here, and it is really I don't know of anything in my life, and I've all of these 44 years since it, and 85 years, thank God for life in general. I don't know of any event that had all of the elements that this event had. I don't know of any event, and there have been a lot of events in the last 44 years across our nation. I don't know of any event that captured the imagination of the American public, that captured the imagination of journalists, of writers, of producers. I don't know of any event that did that. Here we are 44 years later, and here we are still using today's technology talking about this event.
Yeah.
I don't know of any event that's happened in the entire nation over 44 years that every year they come back and they commemorate it again and they bring attention to it again. So to you and your colleagues that kind of are the moving force here, thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I love telling the story, and certainly I have more to say, but I want to be respectful of
I,
my other presenters as well. So
we'll get to stuff. We will.
okay,
But when I saw the video on the 13th, I mean, that's one of the things that occurred to me was that the complexity of it, because you had people in the water, you need water rescue equipment, you need cold weather equipment, you need metal extrication equipment, you need metal cutting and all that. Plus, you need transport and other things. You need manpower. You need all these specialized tools, and it was just an extraordinary combination of things. Now, when it went down, these people were stranded in the middle of the water. The fire department uh, powered up the boat, the John H. Glenn. There were ambulances that were dispatched, fire trucks, but no vehicle that was at the scene had any sort of equipment to rescue people from the middle of the water. The fireboat was stuck in the ice. It would take time to go all the way around Haynes Point, and time was of the essence. These people were in ice water, having survived a crash, risking hypothermia, and no way to get them out of the water until somebody called up, I guess it was National Airport, called up the park police. I don't know why they thought of the park police, but they called up the park police and they said, "Are you guys flying?" And uh, Don Usher didn't answer the phone. He was the chief pilot with the park police, and ultimately it was his decision whether or not to fly that day. And I'm not a pilot. I don't even play flight simulator, but my understanding is that the conditions at the time were outside of safe flying conditions. The ceiling was very low, about 200 feet, visibility of a quarter mile. Helicopters, you may or may not know, don't have all the equipment that an airliner does, so they fly by visual flight rules. You have to see where you're going. And Don, could you please explain what your thought process is? What I mean, this was a terrible, terrible weather situation, and yet you didn't seem to hesitate that you were going to respond. What was it like there in the park police headquarters there?
Well, the as you said, the first call came in kind of as an inquiry without telling us exactly what was happening. They wanted to know if we were available and that they were having trouble locating an aircraft. And should the need arise, would we be available to go? The weather, as you pointed out, 200 obscured ceiling with about a quarter mile and blowing snow was pretty daunting. But the area they were talking about over on the 14th Street Bridge was pretty much the low-lying area for us. We could almost access that in almost any weather condition because we had the ability to get across from the South Capitol Street Bridge where we were located back into the 14th Street Bridge area. So when they initially called to see if we were available, I ran in, checked the weather, We had already pre-flit the aircraft, so the aircraft were ready to go. Our problem was that we had so much snow out on the ramp that we couldn't get the helicopters outside. So we began the process of trying to get the aircraft outside, the Eagle One out the door. And luckily, my crew member, Ron Gailey, the paramedic I routinely flew with, he had a plow on the front of his truck because he did a little bit of side business. So it, from the aviation viewpoint, from Eagle One's response, it's just a series of coincidences that all seem to work in our favor to get us where we were going. It just, every time I look back, it's amazing all the things lined up as they did. So Ron cleared the ramp. Gene Windsor, the paramedic who went with me on that day, we pushed the aircraft outside, hooked it up, fired it up. By that point, they were asking for us. They had called back into the hangar and said, "Come on, we think we're missing an aircraft." And Ron stayed with his vehicle, assuming we probably were going to go over there and come back pretty quickly because it was probably something that was fixable or foundable right away. But for the weather, I had to decide to stay over the water where I had very little reference, peripheral vision reference to the height of the off the ground I was, or take the city. And since there was nothing in my way, I took the city route. And we crossed the South Capitol Street Bridge right above the lights, flew up South Capitol Street Bridge to the Southwest Freeway. And at that particular moment, we realized there was a lot going wrong because everything was red lights as far as we could see heading towards Virginia. So staying above the street lights, looking through my chin bubble, because if I looked out through the main bubble, all I saw was gray. There was nothing to see unless I looked down. So we flew across the Southwest Freeway looking through the chin bubble. And right as we reached the 14th Street Bridge, Mother Nature kind of kicked in to help us a little bit. And suddenly we probably had about a 400-foot ceiling and about a quarter mile of visibility. But we got out of the snow. That was the important part. And from that point, it was just looking at things quickly to determine what it was we were working with. And that's when I told the tower, yes, there is an aircraft in the water, because we noticed the shattered ice, the wreckage on the inbound 14th Street Bridge, and traffic everywhere on the outbound. But we could see that there was a fuselage or a piece of a fuselage in the water. So that started the rescue.
Now, Eagle One, the park police, you're mainly law enforcement. And the Eagle One, somebody's got a phone. If you could mute the
the other day, university of it.
let me mute this. Eagle One's not equipped for rescue. You don't have a hoist. You didn't have rescue equipment. I understand you did some medevacs, but that was like at Rock Creek Park or something like that. But you land the helicopter, you load a person on board, and then you take off. You're not equipped for this sort of thing. You don't have any equipment, and you had the wrong helicopter for it. So what are you going to do?
Yeah, that was at the state of the art for the U.S. Park Police at that moment. We had two Long Rangers and a Jet Ranger, and as you point out, no hoist, nothing to attach to, no rescue nets. So Gene grabbed the tow rope off of our tug and threw it in the aircraft and looked around, and we had found, I think he found a throw ball, a little buoy that when it hit the water would ignite the buoy and it would open up into a little personal flotation device, which as soon as we activated it, it blew away. So that was the end of that one and left us with the rope. But you're right. We were primarily law enforcement and presidential protection. Then came medevac, and we did most of our medevac supporting the Baltimore shock trauma. So we spent most of our time in Maryland if we were on medevacs. And our rescues were predominantly limited to Great Falls, Maryland, where a lot of people fell in the river, and that really most of the time wasn't a rescue, that was a body recovery, or down at the Little Falls pumping station, because a lot of people thought they could take rafts over the Little Falls pumping station and they would get caught in the hydraulic on the other end of the Little Falls pumping station. And most of the time there, that was a body recovery too. But we did have some experience working around the water. We just didn't have any equipment that made us look like we were the Coast Guard. We were not the Coast Guard.
And so how did you approach it? You see the people in the water. You and Gene are talking things out. How are you going to approach it, or what happened when you see these people in the water?
Yeah, the helicopter has a little switch where we can go ahead and go to hot mic. So Gene and I, even though we didn't work with each other, we certainly, on a routine basis, we certainly did the same things with different crew members all the time. So Gene and I jumped on the hot mic, and we quickly took a look. We shot an approach into the area where the fuselage was. And if you've ever seen the video, we immediately went into a whiteout where we blew all the snow. So we were totally encapsulated in a snowstorm for about 10 or 12 seconds while I watched the ice underneath of me to make sure I didn't drift anywhere. And once the snow blew out of the way, we got a good look at the fuselage and identified 6 victims that were still above the water. Within our view, there were 2 bodies that were also on the ice towards the DC side, laying on the ice, and immediately under the outbound 14th Street Bridge, there was another body laying under the bridge with a rope dropped down to it, where someone had tried to rescue that person before they passed. But Gene immediately hooked up our tow rope into the aircraft, and he wrapped it around one of our seatbelts. So we snapped our seatbelt, wrapped it around the seatbelt, opened the door, and we had already been visited by Bert Hamilton, who, while we were setting the aircraft up, he swam out to the aircraft and grabbed a hold of the skids. So Gene got him to hold right there. We dropped the rope to him. And when I say it's a tow rope, that's exactly what it is. A tow rope about maybe a little bit smaller than your thumb, with 2 metal clips on the end that we hooked to the toes of the skids. And the other end, we just wrapped around our little tug that we pulled things in and out with. It was essentially a golf cart was what we used to pull it in and out. So Gene hooked up on one side, dropped the rope down to Bert. He wrapped it around his chest and latched it. So we lifted him out of the water, kept him very low to the ground. And as we were coming over to the shoreline, I realized I had other problems. There was a tree in the way, and there was an ambulance right up against the riverbank with the antenna, the whip antenna, and everything in the way. So while they were unhooking Bert Hamilton from the rope, I was on the loudspeaker because no one would answer us on mutual aid. Everybody else was so busy they didn't have time to talk to a helicopter on mutual aid. So I started yelling on the loudspeaker, and that's how I directed traffic on the shoreline, was speaking them without ever being to hear them back, but telling them to move the ambulance and somebody get that tree. And firefighters ran over and pushed the tree over, and they moved the ambulance out of the way. And we were able to drop off Bert, turn around, and head back for the second one. The second one turned out to be Kelly Duncan, and they handed the rope, eventually worked its way to her. What we didn't understand was she never clipped in. She wrapped it around herself and was holding
She had it tucked
the
under her
rope.
arm.
Yeah, she had
holding
it
herself
under
up
her
like that.
arm. Yeah, she never clipped in. So we picked her up to about 15 feet off of the water, flew her over to the shoreline. She did a 1-foot landing, and they took her. And when they undid the rope, she wasn't clipped. So once again, circumstance, how can these things happen? Before Kelly Duncan came to be on the shoreline, she had found a personal flotation device and put it on Patricia Felch Now, don't know how that happened or what the circumstances were, but she put it on Patricia Felch. That again, another circumstance that we just couldn't plan for in this process. But after we took the stewardess to the shoreline, Gene said, "Don, this is taking forever. We've got to get some more help." So I asked on the loudspeaker for any other ropes they had, and they gave me a ring buoy with about a 20-foot line on it. The ring buoy was small enough that it wouldn't fit over your shoulders and it was meant really like a swimming pool ring buoy that you would wrap your arm around and they would pull you to shore. And that's what we used for the next pass. And we had all three of the survivors on the one side of the fuselage were coming with us at once. So we thought, okay, this is great. We've got all three. Patricia Felch couldn't hold on. She had the life preserver. She was out in open water. If she would have dropped off, we would have lost her and she would have drowned immediately. Joe Stiley, Joe Stiley at that particular point grabbed a hold of Priscilla Torrado. So he had his head and an arm through the ring buoy and he was holding on to her. So we were dragging all three of them across through the ice until Patricia Felch dropped off. And when she dropped off, luckily with a PFD, she floated and stayed where she was. So we were okay. We brought Joe and Priscilla up to within 20 feet of the shore, but he lost control of her going across an ice floe. So we moved Joe to shore, but while we moved Joe to shore, the aerodynamics of a helicopter means that rotor wash is going in all directions, and it started blowing Priscilla Torrado away from us rather than towards the bank. So there was nothing we could do. We were rafting her away. Jean went back. We tried using the ring buoy. She obviously had a lot of vision issues. She finally wrapped her arm around the ring buoy enough that it looked like we should be able to get her that short distance. Unfortunately, about halfway across, she rotated off of the ring buoy and was about to drown. Once again, circumstances you just can't plan for. A guy on the shore by the name of Lenny Skutnik, a Congressional Budget Office employee, who'd have thunk, coat, boots off, and he goes. So he dives in from the shore, grabs Priscilla right as Gene and I are trying to figure some way to save this woman, and he takes her to shore. So once again, that moves the whole process. So now we can go back out to get Patricia Felch. When we go to Patricia Felch, she indicated she couldn't hold on to any of the ropes. So Gene and I agreed that he would grab her, pull her up onto the skid. He would go outside of the aircraft, pull her up onto the skid, and he would hold on to her long enough to get her to shore. I flew the aircraft with the skid right by her head, looking at her, stopped so Gene could grab a hold of her. He transferred her up onto the skid, and as the weight transferred onto the aircraft from out of the water, obviously the skids began to get wet. And he reminded me that his feet were getting wet. So I made adjustments for how deep the aircraft was sitting at that point and started a pedal turn to lift the tail rotor higher away from the water. And during the pedal turn, he got a good hold of her and he said, "I got her." And we zoomed her right to shoreline and dropped her right into the arms of the firefighters, which left our last, the sixth victim. But when we went out, the fuselage had turned a little bit, dropped a little bit, and he was out of sight. We tried to locate Arlen Williams, but in earlier discussions that he was having with Joe Stiley, he had indicated he was either strapped in the seatbelt or he was stuck in the wiring and debris and couldn't free himself. And once Joe Stiley mentioned that he had tried to reach over to him and just ran into wire and debris, so he couldn't actually reach underneath to see what was going on. So we confirmed the passing of the individual that was all the way out on the ice towards the DC side. We looked a little bit further around to see if there was anything else we could do, and then lifted up onto the 14th Street Bridge and landed, because when we arrived, we had seen at least 40 people standing on the shoreline and assumed that these people had come out of this aircraft, that somehow they had managed to get to shore. So we had a lot of people that we still had to deal with. And that turned out to be a wrong assumption, but at the moment for us, it made sense that we had some people survive that were trapped around a fuselage and people all along the shores. So when we landed on the 14th Street Bridge, Gene jumped out of the aircraft, and as he was running down the 14th Street Bridge to find a firefighter to speak to get to a radio, one of them grabbed him and said, "What do you want to do with this other victim?" We then discovered that Patricia Felch, when she was brought out of the water, there was no room in the one ambulance that was on site. There was only one ambulance there the whole time. So they carried her up the hill, put her in a Metro bus, turned on the heater in the Metro bus for her so that she would warm up, wrapped her in blankets, and began an assessment, a medical assessment of her in the Metro bus while they waited for an ambulance to get to them so they could haul her away. Gene and I, not sure what we were going to be doing, I arranged for one of the 5 U.S. Army Hueys, which had somehow come through the same horrible weather I did from Fort Belvoir, and we brought them over onto the 14th Street Bridge, and one of the Hueys flew Patricia Felch to the MedStar shock trauma unit in DC. So of the victims, only one of them made it to a shock trauma unit. The others went to National Orthopedic Hospital, just off of 295. And as it turned out, their injuries were such that National Orthopedic, with a lot of help from everybody in the area, were able to deal with their injuries. And Patricia Felch had a lot of injuries, so it was good that she ended where she did.
Yeah. You mentioned the coincidences, the fortuitous things. The day was full of these. There were people. There was the right person in the right place who took the right action. And I want to point out, you talk about your helicopter flight as though you're just sort of flying through the city, and that was a really, really dangerous flight. And when you're over the water, so many things could have gone wrong. There was so much debris in the area. All it would take is for something to be kicked up to the rotor. It could have ended up very, very badly. Nothing bad happened. And I want to point out that when Gene Windsor reached out for Nikki Felch, he was unrestrained in the helicopter. There was nothing keeping him in the helicopter. He's standing on the skid, and the only thing that attached him to the helicopter was the communications cord to his helmet.
Right.
He was on the edge and could have easily have fallen in, which would have made things horribly worse. But I understand he was when you went back to look for Arlen Williams, he would have jumped in the water to help him if you had spotted him. It seemed like Gene was pretty vested in this rescue.
Yes. And he was considering jumping out of the aircraft to get Priscilla Tirado. And luckily Lenny's intervention left us in the rescue mode rather than me trying to get Gene back up off ashore and then head back out.
Yeah. One thing I'm hearing from both Steve and from you, one thing that was chronic on that day were communications problems. The helicopter had the PMARS, the Police Mutual Assistance Radio System, and the fire department had the FMARS, a similar thing. And the PMARS was established for this reason. It would be a radio frequency that would, for all the departments in the area, and it was not used on that day. And on the fire department side, I there was something like 9 different radio frequencies that were being used. You mentioned there was this one helicopter that was there at the Riverside, which was from National Airport. There were other ambulances. What I say? There was one ambulance there at the scene by the Riverside. There was other ambulances there up on the bridge, but there was no way to communicate to those people that we need an ambulance over here. And so they kept putting the survivors, the victims, into the one ambulance until it was literally there was no more room in the back of that ambulance. Things have changed since then, have they not, Steve? Is in terms of these communication problems, the interoperability, and within the helicopter. I mean, we could talk about how things are different with Eagle One too, but a lot of the problems that arose on January 13th are no longer problems. Is that safe to say, Steve?
Uh, yes, they're no longer problems, but they certainly were major problems on the 13th. And Don has alluded to some of them. You have highlighted some of them. Just to educate the larger audience, the fire department back then had 3 frequencies: channel 1, channel 2, and FMAR. The police department, I think they may have had about the same, plus PMARS, Police Mutual Aid Radio System. The unfortunate thing is that neither one of them could talk to each other. Similarly, DC could not talk to Arlington at the other end of the bridge. Similarly, the Metropolitan Police Department, which is the police department for the city of Washington, could not talk to Park Police. So it was just a mess. But the state of the art, as I think Don said early on, didn't allow for that. It was the best we had to work with, and you just had to learn to work with it. But an interesting thing happened. After the event, by several months, the expected congressional investigations and inquiries began into this event, which, by the way, on a clear day, you could see the Capitol building. It's that close. I don't think you could see it on that day because of the snow. But the inquiry was established, and then invariably the testimony before various committees began. The fire chief of Washington, because he was the fire chief, was obviously invited to speak and tell his story of that day. His name was Norman Richardson. I knew him very well. He and I were in the department about the same length of time. He had ascended very quickly, and I elected not to. But he called me up and he said, "Steve, I've been invited to go testify before Congress on Air Florida." He says, I really would appreciate it if you would do it for me." Well, I said, "Chief, you're the chief." He says, I know, but I'm very comfortable if you go up there and do it for me." So he provided me some information. It wasn't very long, but anyhow, I got all dressed up when the day came, put on all the uniforms you seldom wear unless you're going to a funeral, and found my way to Capitol Hill, and found my way to the right building, and found my way to the right room, and eventually walked in probably 45 minutes early, because if you're in the fire department, you're always early. You're never late. So into it I went, and just kind of felt a little bit awkward because I had never been in a situation like that before. But eventually the members of Congress began to fill the dais, and chairman called it to order. And the chairman was a gentleman by the name of Daniel Inouye. Daniel Inouye was the senator for the state of Hawaii.
That's right.
And some of you that remember that era, he was without his right arm. His right arm had been completely shattered during World War II. And he was just a real gentleman in an era, I should say, in an area where being a real gentleman was the expectation. We know how that has all changed. So he finally came in and he hammered down the gavel, and I'm sitting at the table, and it had kind of an open area in front of the legs, and except for the wires that came off of the microphone, you could see my legs, and my legs were doing one of these, you know. because I didn't know what I was going to be asked, and I was careful about what I was going to say because I didn't know what it would mean. But he nailed the gavel, and then he said, "Mr. Souder," he says, "may I call you Steve?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "Thank you." So you can right away see the dynamic that's at work here. He recognized my apprehension, if you will, and he started to call me by first name, which is a good way of connecting with people. And he says, "I really appreciate you being here and what you and all of the others did on that day." He said, "We're here to help you, but we don't know what help you need." So he said, "Would you please tell me about that day and some of the problems that were encountered and what we can do, we being the Congress, to help?" Well, this is kind of a wide open invitation that I knew I had to take advantage of. The question was how I kind of framed what we needed. Long story short, certainly a lot of it surrounded what we were talking about a moment ago, and that is available radio channels, which are technically called spectrum. And back then, the fire department had a very, very narrow sliver of the spectrum, and similarly for the police department. And depending upon the agency, and that could be railroads, it could be forestry, it could be law enforcement. There's a lot of people that have a slice of the spectrum, if you will. Some of it more, some of it less. But anyhow, the fire department had very little, and now this event said it was just not enough. So I began to describe this in a way that I thought would be understandable using that analogy. In fact, I think I referred to it as look at it as a piece of baloney. And they just went along at some point in time and carved out different widths of spectrum and said, "Here's your spectrum, go talk on it." And similarly, the radio manufacturers, they made radios that were only designed for that one spectrum. So you couldn't talk to another neighbor, if you will, or the end of the bridge or the helicopter in the sky. So I explained to him, I said, "Senator, we really need more radio channels, or we need more spectrum." He says, "Well, where do you get that from?" And I said, "Well, all of that is governed by the Federal Communications Commission." He said, "Well, do they have any more?" And I knew they did. And I said, "Well, they do, but it's already allocated to another user, if you will." He says, "Well, are they using it?" And I said, "Well, I don't, I'm not sure, but they may not be using it." He said, "I'll take care of that." And the meeting ended, not that abruptly, but the meeting ended. And what I now know happened is he went back to his office and he called the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, and he explained in lay terms what we were talking about. And lo and behold, within 2 weeks' time, the Federal Communications Commission had made some rulings and changed the criteria, and a large block of spectrum was now set aside for use by public safety, law enforcement, and fire rescue and EMS, for us to do with in a way that was way more efficient than what we were using at the time. Gigantic, gigantic outcome of this incident. Had it not been for this incident, something like that may have happened, but this was the catalyst that made it happen just like that. And in Washington, very few things happen just like that. But it did happen. And then there were two issues. The radio manufacturers had to make radios that could talk on this new piece of spectrum, and public safety had to say, how are we going to divvy this up so that we allow a new allowance of spectrum to a wider number of people in whatever number they can justify. And that was a challenge that I happened to be able to be a part of. Very, very proud that I was, not immediately after, because I retired a couple of years later, but after I retired, and I was working for the Arlington County 911, I had an opportunity to work on that whole project. And it's another thing for another day, but it really was a very, very significant outcome of the event. I remember with a smile on my face, my nervousness that day, but I also remember how that Senator Daniel Inouye, made me very comfortable to the point that I could talk to him, not dissimilar to where we're talking here today. So thanks for bringing that forward, Bruce.
It's nice to, it must give you a good feeling to play that role in something that improved the entire field.
It did, and I might add that over time it radiated out like a ripples on a lake, and across the United States, border to border, ocean to ocean, the whole public safety communications infrastructure and equipment and allocations changed over 20 years time. And the leader in all of that was the Washington area because we got the spectrum first. And we could really make the case we knew what we needed to do, and we commenced to do it. People volunteered immense amounts of time. Jurisdictions allowed their employees that had that wherewithal and that skill set to work with it. But there's another component to it that deserves to be given a shout out, and that is the Washington Metropolitan Council of Governments.
Yes,
We
which
call
I
it COG for
covered that in the
short.
book. Very instrumental in improving things.
Absolutely. And COG, because of the nature of the term, the Council of Governments, you can just imagine, there's 20 some odd governments in the metropolitan Washington area, and they all had a seat at the COG table, and they all dealt with region-wide problems in all manner of disciplines. It could be water sewer treatment, it could be electricity, it could be road infrastructure, it could be any number of things. And the Fire Chiefs Committee of the COG was very instrumental in working with this group of people that were working the channel part and also in working with the FCC. So it really, they deserve an immense amount of effort. And for whatever it's worth, if you don't have I don't know where you're listening from, folks, but if you don't have a council of governments in your community, please remember this comment and please advocate for it, because it is a vehicle that can get a lot of things done in a very collaborative, cooperative, and productive way. So thanks again, Bruce.
One additional thing from the Virginia perspective for that day, it kind of surprised me when I got the information, but when the plane hit the bridge, it severed part of the railing. And the railing had all the communication cables between DC and Virginia in it. So it knocked out probably 98% of the ability to even call DC and communicate in any meaningful way.
I did not know that.
Thank you, Monty.
Virginia, the first time we knew about the thing was a REAC operator named Evie White was the first one to go ahead and call us. So
that's right.
Just my quick tidbit there. Didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I appreciate that. And I wanted to ask Don about what changed after January 13th. The Park Service got a new Eagle One. I mean, the mission changed a little bit with the Park Police.
Well, most of the changes, obviously, for us were mission oriented. We immediately looked into rescue nets because we realized we had a huge deficit there. As we looked into, and we settled on some rescue nets that could be set up inside of the aircraft without having to use a sling or anything else. It just wrapped through the aircraft and hung between under the aircraft, and we could deploy in flight. The smaller one, that was a one person, and we had essentially a 4 to 5 person larger one that we would deploy before we took off. Washington National Airport grabbed one of those. They bought one for themselves to have it available. So any aircraft that came in support of another situation where they had people in the water and needed to get them out quickly, they could also utilize the larger net. And Great Falls, Maryland did the same. They also took a Billy Pugh rescue net up there for use by us or Maryland State or Virginia State or whoever responded to assist up there with the Park Service. The second thing was we also started shopping radios now that new frequencies were suddenly popping up. And we settled on a 9600 channel radio that we could control both simplex and duplex.
Wow.
So instead of us flying to an accident scene out by Manassas and looking for red lights and flares, they would actually give us the frequency of the ambulance and firefighters on scene where we could talk to them direct. And suddenly we knew about wires and things that we had no idea. We were coming into land. They would tell us about the slope of the road, any recommendations they had, the patient condition. So that became a huge improvement for us. And one other thing I think that was an unanticipated benefit was that the people of the Washington metropolitan area started looking at, wait a minute, that's a police helicopter out there rescuing people. So the park police for a while could do no wrong. If we flew over Alexandria at 2 o'clock in the morning on a medevac coming into the Washington area, they would call, the citizens would call the tower and say, who's that helicopter flying around out here? And they'd say, that's Eagle One on the medevac. They'd go, oh, okay, never mind. That's okay. That's fine. That was Eagle One, no problem. Yeah, goodbye. And they'd hang up. So it certainly helped us, and it certainly brought us more attention to the point that, as you pointed out, in 1989 and 1990, we also, the park police acquired its first Bell, essentially a Huey, which was then, we moved up essentially to a 13 to 15 place aircraft with a rescue hoist, with all of the equipment on it that it would have breezed through the Air Florida incident, picked everybody up on the first pass, took them all to shoreline, and that would have been the end of the rescue. So there were mission improvements, communications, equipment, larger aircraft. All those things came as a result of Air Florida. Yes.
Yeah. Air Florida was a tragedy of just unimaginable magnitude. The lives lost. It was just it's heartbreaking. But I think that the lessons learned from that day in all the different areas, from aviation, from the law enforcement, the fire service, dispatch, communication, from how planes are maintained and de-iced at airports. The people, anybody who travels today, anybody who relies on fire EMS benefits from things that happened on January 13th. And we're all, I think, better off. Our quality of life is better. We're better equipped for these things in the future. Before we run out of time, I wanted to open things up and ask if people had questions, wanted to talk to you guys, whether people who are online or here in the room, if anybody would like to has a question or something you want to bring up. People are quieter. Yes, sir.
Just want you mentioned live coverage in CNN.
Yeah.
I worked for CNN.
Okay.
35 years, and I was one of the first people from CNN on the 14th Street.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I'm also very good friends with Steve.
Steve? You got a buddy here, Steve. We have a CNN fellow who was here with CNN. He was one of the first CNN people. What's your name? Vito. Vito's here.
Vito, hello, my friend. A little story about CNN. You mentioned earlier about CNN was a new network and they had just begun to do their thing, if you will. And remember the story I told you about my battalion chief friend, McKeldin Fleming, who decided to go home to his home in Wheaton and eat his hamburger along the way. Well, by the time he got home and sat down for dinner, by that time, the metro train crash had occurred. So we're, 45 minutes maybe after he left me off. And he's sitting there at his dining room table, eating dinner with his family and watching CNN News from the 14th Street Bridge. And then, of course, he got on the phone to do some stuff with Metro, and that's another story that maybe you'll get to and maybe not. But my point is that was CNN's kind of introduction to live news from the scene. And Vito, thank you for being there. I know that story really well, and it's a great story. And Vito, thank you for all you've done in your long, long career.
I would, if there aren't questions, I would like to point out again, if people missed it earlier, that we have present online Charles Pereira, who is a park police photographer who shot these iconic black and white photos of the rescue. That they're all over the place. You see the Kelly. You see Nikki Felch hanging from Gene Windsor's boot. That's Charlie's picture. The overhead shot of the helicopter over the water. These gorgeous, gorgeous, unbelievable photos. Charlie, is there, you want to talk about what you experienced that day?
Thank you, Bruce. That day, as everybody's mentioned already, was unusual to say the least. I happened to be called into our communications center that's at Ohio Drive, right across the river from the airport. And I was hanging out because my boss had said, "Hey, Charlie, go get some, we're getting ready to put out the Park Police annual report, and go get some pictures of cops doing good stuff in the snow." So I was waiting in the communications section for our field commander to show up and talking to the guys. And there's a red crash phone in the communications center, and it rang, and it never rings. And I'm listening to half of the conversation, and I'm hearing, what? Airplane, maybe in the river. And at the park police, when you work for a police department or a fire department, you're always listening for little clues that give you a little bit of an advantage on time-wise. And I immediately grabbed my gear thinking that, okay, a small plane has gone down in the river and maybe I can get there in time to the bridge, trying to figure out where to go. And I knew that they were also in contact with Eagle One, but like Don said, the weather was so bad, the helicopters were inside the hangar, and I'm not thinking, oh, they're going to show up. Anyway, I started running towards the 14th Street Bridge with my camera gear, and I'm thinking, okay, everybody's okay. The small planes in the water. I'm loading one camera up as I'm running with black and white and another one for color, right? And thinking, no, I get halfway there. One of the Park Service trucks comes by. "What are you running down the street for?" It was a snowplow. And I told him, "I'm trying to get there. Something happened on the bridge." Jumped on the truck. He lets me off at the base of the bridge. And there's two bridges there, so inbound and outbound. And I happened to, fortunately, for photographic purposes, chose the one that the plane didn't hit. So I'm looking down between the bridges at a hole in the ice and pieces of fuselage, like Don said. And I got there just as Eagle One was coming in. And I had almost 10 years on the job at that point. I was the chief photographer there and had been working with the aviation guys for years, knew all of our pilots well, obviously flew with them a lot. And again, obviously trust them with your life. And I'm looking down there, the helicopter comes in. And as Don said, photographically, it was terrible a minute before the helicopter got there. And then the sky opened up, the snow stopped. And not just for me, but the most iconic stuff that was really done was by Chester Panzer. And I don't see that Chester's on this call, but Chester was a cameraman at WRC, the local NBC affiliate, I think, in Washington at the time. And he was at the airport filming planes being de-iced and that whole procedure. And he got the word that something happened and got there very quickly. And Chester and I have become friends. We're the only ones, I think, that got any images from that day, his video and my stills. And what I was, as a photographer, and you're looking through a lens, you're separate from the incident. I'm looking at it both eyes and I'm seeing things going on, but I'm also trying to put everything into perspective for a proper photograph. I'm somewhat detached from it, but I also know that's our helicopter, and so many times during this, it was a very short period of time that all of this took place. But again, as people say, it was a lifetime as well. And as I was looking there, my biggest worry, I know those people were in the water, and I know what the circumstances were because of the weather. But I also saw so many times that I thought, we're going to lose this helicopter. I'm going to lose some friends of mine that are inside that helicopter. I saw the skids go underwater. I saw the tail rotor so close to not only the shoreline, but the water. And I know what was going to happen if that took place. I don't know how else to put anything other than that day changed my life as well. From the photographer, from a photographer standpoint, there was a lot of tension brought. They held up the Concorde at Dulles Airport for copies of my photographs to go into Paris Match magazine the next day. There were these crazy things that happened that unfortunately were about, it was about the loss of life, but it was also about the courage of so many people that day that gives us hope.
I feel the same way. It struck me that so many people stepped out of their comfort zone to walk in the snow and to stand in the snowdrift or walk in the water to help people that they don't even know. Really restored my faith in humanity. It was an extraordinary day. And I just want one last thing about the photo. And it's just a coincidence, but visually, the snow and the black and white, it lent itself to that. They just looked so good with the stark white snow and the dark black water. They're just gorgeous, gorgeous photos. And I just want to say one more time, with Don Usher's flying, he controlled that helicopter so precisely, so carefully. It was just absolutely extraordinary with some of the, it just absolutely blew my mind how well he controlled that craft in those circumstances. It was just absolutely amazing. Everybody, I think, that day rose to their best. Roger Olean talks about that all the time, that he just did, as good as he could do. And as for Chester's not here today, we are good friends. Me and Chester. I'm going to be seeing him tomorrow. I'm doing things at Politics and Prose. He's going to be there for that. But Charlie took the video. If you go look at the Eagle One, the video that's displaying in the lobby that shows Priscilla Tirado floundering on the ice, and it's the close-up one. That's all Chester Panzer's video. Just absolutely extraordinary. And he, in talking with him, I know that he was concerned that he was going to record people's deaths. It was so dicey that, he was torn between, you just can't watch this. These people are floundering and drowning right in front of him. You did your job, he did his job, Don did his job, and Steve did his job, and everybody came through it. But I think that day is a testament to the professionalism of the first responders, everybody, the first responders, so the park police, the media people, the fire police, EMS, all of them. It was people at their best that day to save lives, and I think that it says a lot. But are there other questions, or anybody would like to? If not, we can sort of wrap things up, and I got some books here I can sign if anybody wants them. But
hey, Bruce, I saw one question appear
Okay,
at the
yes.
bottom of my screen from one of your attendees.
Oh, I didn't see it.
Something about how things had changed. I couldn't read it that quickly.
How would the system be different? Oh, that's a good one. How would it be different today with thousands of calls coming in? I guess that could be a problem today when, because now everybody has cell phones. When something happens, do hundreds of people call into the to 911 all at once? And
Well, absolutely they do, and it's a blessing in disguise. There certainly were thousands and thousands of calls where you get one phone call and it's sketchy, and you complained, if you will, or talked about the inadequacy of no information. Fast forward 20 years, more, and now an event like that will bring hundreds of calls, and you complain because everybody's reporting the same thing.
yeah,
But clearly, it is better with the advent of cellular technology and the ability of people to call. And that is also an area that I think deserves just a little bit of attention, if you don't mind. Uh, if you've watched the news in recent years, you'll hear a lot of interviews from the scene of whatever's going on, and they'll talk about incident command and unified command. And to many people on this call, that may resonate, you know what that is, and to other people, they may not know what that is. But back to January 13th of 82, there was no incident command system. Uh, because it was what it was, all of the public safety agencies in the Washington area, and certainly the fire departments, were silos unto themselves. They didn't talk to each other very often. They didn't operate at the same event very often. They didn't ask each other for help very often. The way they structured their radio system and the way they marked their fire apparatus and the way they did this, that, and the other thing was all independent. And that certainly did not work to anyone's benefit in a major event like we've been talking about here. But as an outgrowth of some major early wildland fires on the West Coast, there was developed this incident command system, which is designed to put structure and a hierarchy of players into the incident command network. That really was given a kickstart because of Air Florida locally. And in very short order, the entire metropolitan area, and largely with the auspices of COG, began to talk to each other, collaborate, cooperate, help each other out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So today it's just part of our jargon. We don't even think about where it came from. But the reality is that it was born, at least locally, 44 years ago, which again, I'm looking at the clock, you got about a half hour, Bruce. You know, we're winding down, but I can't emphasize enough, and I know I'm repeating myself, the things that were an outgrowth of January 13th, 1982, 44 years ago, had an absolute profound, in capital letters, bolded and underlined, profound impact on public safety in the metropolitan Washington area. And to everybody that was involved with that, whether they were a firefighter, a patrol officer, a 911 person, or anywhere in the hierarchy, up or down, you all had a role and a part in that because it happened on your watch. And we're all better because of that today. And thank you again for that opportunity.
sure, you bet. I think we are going to wrap up here. There's no other questions from online.
One more comment.
Okay, comment.
I'm also Steve's friend.
Okay.
Steve was the director of Fairfax 911.
He was.
And I took his position. Short years later. But he mentioned things are very different now. And the response last year to the American Eagle flight that crashed, unfortunately, no survivors. Immediately after that plane went down, the communication centers were all talking right away.
Yeah.
Boats were launched right away. Dozens of boats in the whole region were launched right away. And everybody was talking to each other and coordinating at the same time. And none of that would have happened unless these folks on this screen and on this call paved the way for that.
Yeah. What's your name?
Scott Broman.
Scott Broman's here, Steve.
Yes, I know Scott well, and he's a real thought leader in our industry.
Yeah.
And not to belabor that point, but to accentuate what he said, um, just a little less than a year ago, American Eagle crashed into the water, Potomac River, within eyesight of the 14th Street Bridge, uh, because it had collided with an Army helicopter. I think most of you know that story. And the way that it went down, and I'm not talking about crash down, but how the incident went down, the way it was managed, the way it was dispatched, the way it was supported was absolutely, and I hate to use the word flawless because it implies there's no lessons to be learned, but it was literally flawless. And all of the lessons that we learned being spawned by 44 years ago were in full gear at the best of their game and doing what they were designed to do. And no souls could have been saved there either, unfortunately. But nevertheless, the way it was responded to is a credit to everybody. And I'm just so proud to have been a small part of that evolution over 44 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. All right. Well, we'll wrap this up. I want to thank each of you for being here. Steve, thank you so much. And Don, always, thank you so much. And Charlie, it was a pleasant surprise to see you here. I'm so glad you did. And everybody who tuned in online, the folks who came out here, thank you very much. And uh, uh, by all means, I hope that you look into Air Florida Flight 90 a little more, maybe even read the book. Don't bother with the made-for-TV movie, though it's pretty cheesy. But thank you all very much, and thank you for coming.